Back in May of 2018, Sublime Text 3.1 was released, and among the many features and additions in this version of Sublime Text, the command palette gained the ability to accept user input. And this is something that we later learned was implemented as part of the Sublime Merge project. Now, in order to showcase this new behavior, some new commands were added to the command palette in that version of Sublime Text. One of those is the ever popular view package file command, which we have seen in many a video here on the channel. Another is the rename file command, which allows you to interactively rename the current file that you're using. And the third is a perhaps not as well known command named Arithmetic. Now, despite the name of this command, it can do more than just math. So we're going to go ahead and dive on into the variety of things you can do with this very versatile command. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Still slightly sick. Odat Nerd here, and welcome to this video on the arithmetic command in Sublime Text. Now, this is a command that was added back in Sublime Text version 3.1 or Sublime Text build 3170, if you reckon Sublime Text that way. That's actually a stable build. So, if like me, you live in the Bleeding Edge development series, it actually happened a few builds prior to that. And this is a very powerful command. Now, the ability for the command palette to accept input was something that was originally written to support the Sublime Merge Git client, although at the time of this version of Sublime Text, we didn't realize that was in fact the case. Now, this arithmetic command was added to partly showcase the abilities of the new additions to the command palette. So if you're a package developer, it's one of the plugins that are recommended on the plugin API page as an example of how to do text in the command palette. But don't let that simple nature fool you, because despite the name, there's more than just mathematics to this command. As a matter of fact, it allows us to not only inject text into the buffer and replace selected text using math, we can also use expressions, powerful expressions, to manipulate the text inside of the buffer as well. And we have quite a few examples of that. Other things to note here are that this is a command that directly manipulates the content of a buffer. So that means if you are using the macro facility of Sublime Text, which we discussed recently on the channel, you can use this facility to record these sorts of actions in a macro as well, and you can even bind them to a key. And we have an example of that later on in the video as well. So let's go ahead and jump on into a bit of a discussion on what this command is, how it works, and how we can leverage it to make our lives in Sublime more sublime. The arithmetic command itself works by manipulating the selections in the actual buffer. So let's have a quick refresher about selections in Sublime Text and how they work. Now, selections in Sublime Text are represented by carets or cursors or insertion points, or however you might like to refer to that. So here right now we have a single selection in the buffer because there is one cursor. Selections besides existing can either be empty or non-empty. Right now, the selection is empty, but if I was to select these 4 lines of text, we now have a non-empty selection. We have exactly one non-empty selection that happens to be spanning 4 lines. And we can have, of course, multiple selections inside our buffer in a variety of ways. And one of the ways we might do that, and it's something we're going to be seeing a lot in the demonstration portion of the video, is if we were to go to the selection menu, this top command is split into lines, which splits all of the whole selection so that there's one selection on each individual line. And we see that has now converted this from one selection spanning 4 lines to 4 selections, each spanning 1 line. And these are all non-empty selections. And of course, if I was to move the cursor, we now have 4 cursors and 4 selections, but they're all empty selections. So what the state of the selections are, what's selected, what's not, how many cursors there actually are in the buffer matters when you're using the arithmetic command. And if that sounds complicated, don't worry about it. In actual practice, it's a lot more intuitive than you might think it is. And we're going to have a lot of examples to show exactly that. I'm going to coalesce this back down to a single selection at the bottom of the buffer again. And if we jump into the command palette, the arithmetic command is the second one in the list. So did you notice that this command is is even here. Often, if you're like me, if you're going to the command palette, the first thing you're doing is immediately starting to type a filter that's going to find you the command. You might never have noticed that this thing is even in here. Now, when we hit it, it's asking us for an expression. And what we're also not seeing here is currently, that is a preview of what this thing is actually going to do. That's going to appear underneath this little buffer to show us what the command's going to do. Now, when this says expression, what is it actually talking about here? Specifically, it's talking about a Python expression, or more specifically, because of the version of Sublime Text that we're using, a Python 3.3 expression. Anything that represents a valid expression in Sublime Text, or sorry, in Python rather, that returns a value can be used here in this panel. And we have a few things available to us. Firstly, there are 3 pseudo variables that refer to the actual selected text, which is important if you want to be able to do any sort of manipulation. We're going to cover that in just a second. We also have at our disposal all of the built-ins that are built into Sublime Text, the top level functions like the format function, for example. And we also have available to us the entire math library, which if you're a Python developer, it will come as no surprise, is something with math dot and then the name of a mathematical function. And that provides us a large variety of things that we can do to the text inside of this, which goes far beyond simple arithmetic, mathematical type things. Now, whatever you type into this expression is what's going to get inserted or into the buffer if the selections are empty, or replace anything that might actually be selected. So we might put the number 12 here, for example, and now we're seeing an example of the little preview area at the bottom showing us what this command is actually going to do. What does our expression evaluate out to? So it's going to inject the value 12 in here. And we could even say 12 plus. Now, as soon as I type the plus, this isn't a valid expression, so the preview goes away. No matter what I do, I can't enter that. But if I was to add 12 in here, we get the value 24. So executing the command right now would insert the text 24 into the buffer. So if, right away, we can automatically see that if you ever needed to do some sort of mathematics and store the value, this is a very easy way to do that very thing. But as I said, along with that and the other expression items, which we're going to talk about in just a second, we also have the ability to reference the selected text inside of our expression. So let's go ahead and select some text. So now I have one selection in here that is spanning 4 lines. So one non-empty 4-line selection. We go back to the arithmetic command. I'm going to go ahead and just delete that sample expression there. Now there are, as I said, 3 variables that we can use to reference the selection as a whole. The first one of those is S, which represents the actual selected text. So here, the selection is 4 lines of text. So we see one string, and it's represented as a string because it has the single quotes on either end of it, with the text 10 and a new line, and sample and a new line, and so on. It's 4 lines of text represented as a single Python string. If the selection was empty, this would be an empty string. We'd just see 2 single quotes in there. The next variable we can consider in here is the X variable. Now, what X does is take the currently selected text, try to interpret it as a number, and if it is a number, it becomes a number. And if it's not, if it can't be converted into a number, you end up with the value 0. So here, because this is a selection that contains not just numbers, but also text, the value of this ends up being 0. But we're going to see that this enhanced in just a second. The third variable that we can use in here is I, which represents the number of the selection in the buffer. The buffer can have any number of selections you want. The very first selection is numbered 0. The second selection after that is numbered 1, and so on throughout the file. And it's important to note that selections are ordered based on their position in the file and not the order that you actually create them. So that's a distinction that could become important as you're working with this. Now, let's go ahead and cancel out of there and convert this selection from one selection spanning 4 lines to 4 selections, each spanning 1 line. And if we come back into here and pick the arithmetic command again, we're immediately seeing some actual action here. The first variable that we could use is x here in this case. Let's do that because that's the default. This is showing us now 4 values separated by commas because there's 4 selections. So the first selection is the number 10. That's actually a number. It's converted to 10 because the x variable tries to convert its content to a number and sets it to 0 if it can't. So the next 2 lines, sample and text, those aren't numbers. They end up being 0. And the last line is 20. That is a number. So right now, if we were to select this command, what would happen would be those 4 selected texts would be replaced with this, and we'd end up with 10, 0, 0, 20, like so. But we don't want that, so let's go ahead and take that back, come back to the arithmetic command. Now, the other thing that we can do in here, as we said, is the S variable. That's the actual selection. So now we see something similar to what we saw last time. There's now 4 strings instead of 1 string, and each string is the content of a line. And if we were to insert this, we end up with essentially no change because we've replaced the selection with itself. And if we were to go back into there one more time, that last variable is I, which remember is the number of the selection. So there's 4 selections. We now have the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3. The first selection is 0, the second selection is 1, and so on. So if we were to hit the key now, we end up with a little bit of that action going. So now we've numbered that thing right there like so. And so as we can see, we have quite a bit of facility in this thing because remember when we come in here and do this, this x is the value of this selected text, in this case, converted to a number. If you had selected numbers and you wanted to multiply them by 2, go ahead and multiply them by 2. Now the text that will be inserted is 20, 0, 0, 40 instead. Maybe you also want to remove 5 from that. Now we get 15 minus 5 minus 5, 35. Imagine the situation where you're working on a web page and you realize that all of the values for sizes that you've done are off by 1 pixel. You could manually change every single one of them, or you could select all of the values and then jump into the arithmetic command and easily convert that thing into something else. Let's start off with some simple examples here, and that would be uses of the I variable and the X variable. Let's say that you were doing something and you wanted sample line 1 like so, but you actually wanted a bunch of these. You could go ahead and paste in 10 of these lines, but now you have to go back and manually modify all of these things to be from 1 to 10, for example. But what we could actually do is select all of the ones, pull in the arithmetic command and say we want the value to be I because we want them to be numbered based on the selection, but maybe we want that to be I plus 1, and now we very easily have our numbers from 1 to 10. You could also do that sort of thing if you had this line and you decided you wanted to number these lines instead. You could go ahead and add arithmetic and say I plus 1 as well and hit that and then easily prefix all of these things with some number. And as I previously noted, if we take that back to this, perhaps you have this particular list already and you copy part of it out and paste it somewhere else, and now you don't want it to be 1 to 10 anymore. Now you want it to be 11 to 20. How do we do that? Well, we could very easily hop into this and use the X because the X is going to take the selection, convert it to a number. We can easily take that X and add 10 to it, and now all of these numbers are 10 bigger than they were before. So if this was a size in a web page and you decided everything needs to be 6 pixels to the left of where it used to be, easily subtract 6 from a bunch of numbers without having to do it all inside of your head. Of course, it also goes without saying that if for some reason you wanted to have the value of 2 plus 2 and you weren't entirely sure what that was, you go ahead and do that easily as well. If you wanted to, you could also insert it into multiple places at the same time, because if you use this and there's multiple selections, it will get inserted into all of them. Now, let's say that you're working with a data file or you're a software developer and you have some numbers and you want them to be represented in hexadecimal instead of decimal, which is what we have here. How could we do that? Well, that's very easy. Let's go ahead and select all that text, split that selection into lines, jump into our handy arithmetic command where we can use the hex built-in function and specify that we want to convert the value of x to hex. And we can see right there in the preview exactly what this thing is doing. It's going to convert it to A, B, C, and so on. And now we have easily converted these values into a hexadecimal values from decimal. Or perhaps going the other way, you'd rather that you have some hexadecimal values like this and you'd rather they be in decimal instead. Well, that's easy. Select all the text, go like that. We have them all in here and we can use the int function instead and pass it the number that we would like to convert here. And we easily convert those back to the values that they originally started with. This is an example of how the Python built-ins can be used in ways you perhaps might not have expected while you're perusing this command. Now, note that when we select all these numbers, split them into selections, and jump into here and say hex x like so, we end up with values that have this 0x prefix on them. Let's say you wanted this to be hexadecimal, but you didn't want those values on there. Is that possible? It absolutely is. And to do that, we're going to use the format function, which is something that is built into Python, and we're going to format the value of x, and we provided a format specifier of x to say we want it to be hexadecimal, and just like that it has done this. Now this does require you to know a little bit about the functions that are available in Python, but there's a link down in the description of the video to the built-ins that are built into the version of Python that is used in the Sublime Text plugin system to get you started on that if you're unfamiliar with them. So just like so, we can easily convert these values from that decimal value to hexadecimal characters, but without that prefix. And of course, we can take this the other way as well. If we decided we wanted these not to be hexadecimal, but to be decimal instead. And in order to do that, we're going to jump in here and we can use the int function to convert this value to an integer that is base 16. And as soon as we do that, we see I'm not seeing any preview down underneath this telling me what this is going to do. And that's because this doesn't work the way you would expect. Remember, X is representing the selection as converted into a number, but that's not really what we want here. This function wants to take a string and convert it. So what we actually want is the selection instead. So this is why it's handy to have that S value that represents the selected text completely unmarred by any of the other manipulations. Sometimes you want the selection to be interpreted as a number, a physical number, then you would use X in that case. If you want it to be represented as a string, instead use S. So we can go ahead and hit the key, and now we're back to the decimal numbers that we started with, and we didn't have that prefix in the middle. Now, we glossed over this a little bit just a second ago, but the format function in Python is pretty powerful. It allows you to take a value and format it based on a format string that you provide. And there's a whole little mini language, if you will, that represents the things you can format with this function and how that formatting works. And there's a link to that documentation, again, for the Python 3.3 implementation, because that's the version of Python that Sublime is currently using, down in the description of the video as well. In our previous example, we used the format specifier X as a string to represent hexadecimal, but we can actually do other formatting as well. Now here we have some numbers with varying numbers of decimal places, but what if we actually wanted to format this thing so that they all had the same number of decimal places? Well, we could easily select all the text and jump on into our arithmetic command, and what we're going to format here is the value x using the format string of we want a number with decimals that has two decimals after the thing, and we want it to be a floating point value like so. And we can immediately see exactly what that is going to inject. It's formatting them, it's turning them into strings. And when we hit it, we now have all of these things nicely normalized to have exactly two decimal places. And we can even see that some rounding has occurred here in the values in order to make it fit into that particular decimal place. Another thing that you might find yourself wanting to do is converting numbers to be percentages. And in order to do this manually, you would have to multiply these values by 100 in order to shift them around. And that's certainly something that we could do by using this in a variety of ways. So we can go ahead and jump in there and hit this. And if we were to say, x times 100, then we're getting that, but we are not having full control of how many decimal places come after the values in this thing. But what we could actually do here again is use the format function. We're going to format the value of x, which again is a number, and we're going to tell Python that we want to format this as a percentage with, let's say, 2 decimals of precision, and we want it to be a percentage, close the string, and we've easily converted these values into percentages. Up until now, the examples that we've been showing here are perhaps a little bit contrived, just showing some examples of things you can do that aren't necessarily arithmetic related to numbers in your files. And these could come in handy if you're working on text or web pages or programming and all sorts of things like that. Now, here's an example of one that I actually use on a very regular basis at work. I even have a key binding for this on my work installation of Sublime Text. What if we wanted these numbers to be more human readable? Because I work with a lot of log files with a lot of big numbers in them, and you could have to manually go through here and add, say, for example, a comma every third space in order to make this more human readable. But this is really easy to do with the Python format function. So we can jump on into here and format the value of x, and we just wanted to give it a format specifier of just a comma. And just like that, these log numbers are really easy to read. Now, of course, there are a variety of reasons why you might be using Sublime Text. You could be a software developer, you could be a web designer, you might even just be creating regular text files or prose of some sort. And no matter what kind of content you're editing, there's probably some workflow enhancement you could have if you used the arithmetic command. In this example, we have a sample document with a super contrived title, and we'd like that title to be centered in the 80-column document. Now, of course, you could come up here and manually enter some spaces and try to eyeball this thing. But why do that when we have the arithmetic command? So we can select that text. We can go ahead and split that selection into lines and use the arithmetic command and say we want to format the string version of the selections with a format string that says we want to center this text in an 80-column width. And just like so, our document is now centered with the title, and we're good to go on our next steps in this particular project. Now, as we've seen, there's quite a few things we can do with the expression in our arithmetic command here. We can, of course, put numbers in here. If we wanted to, we could do math on these things, which is, appropriate. It's the arithmetic command after all. If you wanted to, you could return strings in here instead by wrapping them in single quotes so that they're Python strings. So if you wanted some text, put some text in single quotes and you can get that injected back as well, just like so. And of course, we can also use those built-in functions like the format function we just saw. So if you had numbers in your file and you wanted them to have some number of decimal places, say 2, you can easily use the format function to bump those out as well. But there's more math functions than just this because Python supports the math library and we have access to that in here as well. So we have access to things like math.pi if we wanted to know the value of the pi constant and for use in one of our expressions or just to inject it into a buffer. Similarly, if you had need to do conversions of angles between degrees and radians, or you wanted to do trigonometric functions, those are all available in this library as well. Say, for example, you also wanted to convert numbers from floating point values into integral values instead. Say we wanted this number to be, the next highest integral value. We could go ahead and say math.ceil to get the ceiling of the math.pi. And as soon as we close the bracket, the next highest integral value from 3.1415 is 4. And of course, if you wanted to go in the other direction, you could replace ceil with floor and go in the other direction. So whether you have a number and you want to convert it to some number of decimal places or round it up or down to integral values, we have all of those sorts of facilities in here, including, as I said, those trigonometric functions as well. There are also some other math functions that perhaps you might find useful. Now, as we've seen throughout all of these examples, if you want to use the arithmetic command, you have to open the command palette, navigate to the appropriate command, and then manually input some sort of expression, say like so, and only then does this command actually execute. And what it does is modify the content of the buffer and the selection of the buffer as well. And that means that although it may not seem like it, this is a command that can be captured and recorded in a macro. So if you find yourself using the arithmetic command in your day-to-day use of Sublime, perhaps also with the inclusion of things like inserting boilerplate text or using key binding or key motions to move around the file and things of that nature, you could record a macro of yourself taking those actions and then easily play them back. And if you're unfamiliar with macros, we covered that just recently on the channel. And from that, we also know that if you can record a command as a macro command, then it must take the arguments that tells it how to play that command back, because it's not going to open the command palette and force us to re-enter the same thing every time. And that means you could bind that command directly to a key as well. And as I mentioned previously, I have a key binding in my work installation of Sublime that uses that format function to insert commas in numbers to make them human readable, because I deal with a lot of log files with non-human readable numbers, and sometimes you need to pull them out and share them in emails, and it's a very quick operation to make those modifications by using a key binding. And here's another example of something like that. And here I'm going to use the view package file command, one of the other commands that was implemented at the same time as the arithmetic command, to open the user Windows keys. And of course, you could also get to your key bindings by using the preferences key bindings menu or command palette item. I'm just opening it up directly here so that we don't get that split window, because I don't need to refer to the default bindings. And here I have a binding to the arithmetic command itself, bound to the key Control-Alt-T. And as we can see, this command takes a single argument of expr, the expression that it should be evaluating. And here I have x times 9/5 plus 32. The x in this particular value works exactly the same as the x if it was in the command palette. It's the content of the selection as interpreted to be a number. And this is actually the formula for converting a temperature from Celsius to Fahrenheit. Because I'm Canadian, I tend to refer to temperatures in Celsius, but my wife is American and she tends to refer to temperatures in Fahrenheit instead. And because this is going to use that X, it requires text to be selected. I also have a context on this key to make sure that all of the selections are non-empty before this key binding will actually trigger. And if you're unfamiliar with context in key bindings, there's a video on the channel for that as well. But with this in place, if I'm over here, we have the numbers 0 and 20. Those are the temperatures in Celsius, the freezing point of water, and the general room temperature, as I tend to think of it, as I personally think of it as a Canadian. But with just the press of a key, I can also invoke that command to know that the freezing point of water is 32 Fahrenheit and room temperature is around about 68 degrees, at least at my house. Despite the name, it's easy to see that there's more than just simple mathematics behind the arithmetic command. There's a lot of versatility hidden in this thing, and it is a great addition, I think, to your Sublime Text tool chest. So, did you know that the arithmetic command existed? Did you know that you could do these various things with it? Let me know down in the comments section below what you think of the arithmetic command. Will you be using it in your day-to-day usage of Sublime Text? That's all I have for this video. Remember to use those buttons down below to show your support. Subscribe if you would like to see the next video as soon as it becomes available. And remember, you can always use the comment section below any video for any questions, comments, requests for clarifications, or suggestions for other Sublime Text topics you'd like to see me cover in a future video. Until those future videos, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.